The auction block smelled of rotting onions and stale tobacco. $10. That was the going rate for a woman who took up too much space. Her brother didn't even look her in the eye when he pocketed the crumpled bills. Then, a shadow blocked the brutal afternoon sun. The pine boards of the makeshift platform bit through the thin, worn soles of Cora's boots. It was high noon in Oakhaven, a town that was less a settlement and more a scab on the edge of the frontier. The air was thick, tasting of unwashed bodies, mule sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of cheap whiskey. She stood at the edge of the stage, her heavy arms crossed over her stomach. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered, thick-waisted, carrying the kind of weight that made floorboards groan and prompted cruel, muttered jokes from men who couldn't pull a plow themselves. Her dress, a faded gray cotton that had been let out at the seams 3 separate times, clung to her damp back. It chafed fiercely under her arms and between her thighs. She didn't cry. She had run out of tears a week ago when her brother, Jeb, told her she was eating them into the poorhouse and he was marrying a girl half her size who didn't want a fat sister-in-law crowding the hearth. "What am I bid?" The saloon owner, acting as an impromptu auctioneer, yelled over the murmur of the crowd. He didn't sound enthusiastic. He sounded bored. "I'll give you $3 for the dress, but you can keep the heifer inside it," a voice called from the back. Laughter erupted, sharp and jagged. Cora stared at a rusted nail protruding from the railing. She focused on the jagged edge of the iron, willing her mind to go blank. Let them laugh, she thought. A familiar, cynical armor hardening over her ribs. Laughter doesn't leave bruises. She knew what she was. A burden. A joke. She expected to go to a widower with 6 screaming children who needed a draft horse and a skirt, or maybe to the local brothel to scrub floors until her knees bled. $4. A miner spat, wiping tobacco juice from his chin. "She can haul water, I reckon." Jeb stood near the stairs, his face flushed beneath his dirt-smudged hat. He looked ashamed, but not enough to stop the proceeding. He just wanted the money. $10. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmurs like a heavy axe blade through wet wood. It was a deep, chest-rumbling baritone that carried no inflection, no humor, and no desperation. The crowd parted. The man who stepped forward didn't look like the miners or the cattlemen. He looked like the mountain itself had spat him out. He was massive, standing a full head taller than anyone else in the dirt square. He wore a coat of patched elk hide, the fur rubbed bare at the elbows. His beard was a thick, unruly tangle of dark brown, streaked with iron gray, and his boots were heavy leather, bound with grease and mud. He smelled, even from the platform, of pine pitch, wood smoke, and something feral and cold. The saloon owner blinked. $10? I have 10 from the mountain man. Do I hear 12? Silence. Nobody wanted to spend $12 on a fat woman, and nobody wanted to bid against a man who looked like he could snap a femur with his bare hands. Sold. Jeb scrambled forward to collect the 2 crumpled $5 bills the man tossed onto a barrel. The mountain man didn't look at Jeb. He didn't look at the crowd. He walked to the base of the wooden stairs and looked up at Cora. His eyes were a washed-out, pale amber, like old whiskey left in the sun. They didn't hold pity. They didn't hold disgust, either. They simply took her in her broad hips, her thick neck, the sweat beading on her forehead. "Name's Caleb," he said. The words grated, rough, and unused. Cora swallowed the dry lump in her throat. Her tongue felt like felt. "Cora, bring your things, Cora." "I don't have things," she answered, her voice flat. "Just what I'm wearing." He nodded once, a sharp economic movement. "Saves time. Let's go." She walked down the steps, her weight causing the wood to creak loudly. Someone in the crowd whistled, a mocking, high-pitched sound. Cora flinched, her shoulders hunching instinctively, trying to make her massive frame smaller. It was a reflex born of a lifetime of apologies for existing. Caleb paused. He turned his head slowly, finding the man who had whistled. The mountain man didn't yell. He didn't draw the heavy hunting knife strapped to his thigh. He merely stared, his amber eyes dead and flat, until the whistler took a sudden, panicked step backward and disappeared behind a wagon. "Wagon's this way," Caleb muttered, turning his back on the town. Cora followed him. Her thighs rubbed together painfully with every step, the coarse cotton acting like sandpaper against her skin. She watched his broad back, waiting for the reality to set in. He had bought her. She was property. A piece of heavy machinery purchased for $10. She wondered cynically if he expected her to pull the wagon up the mountain instead of the mules. She set her jaw. She wouldn't weep. If she was to be a beast of burden, she would be a silent one. The wagon ride was a bone-rattling agony. The trail leading away from Oakhaven and up into the ragged peaks of the divide was barely a rutted deer path. Cora sat on the wooden bench beside Caleb, her hands gripping the splintering edge of the seat so tightly her knuckles turned a mottled white. Every time the heavy wagon wheels hit a rock, her bulk shifted. She couldn't help it. She spilled over the center line of the bench, her thick thigh pressing heavily against his buckskin-clad leg. Every time it happened, she gasped, quickly yanking herself away, terrified he would strike her for crowding him. But Caleb never raised a hand. He merely clicked his tongue at the two large, shaggy mules pulling the load, his massive hands holding the leather reins with a relaxed, almost lazy grip. The air grew thinner, losing the stifling heat of the valley and taking on a sharp, biting chill. The smell of rotting town garbage was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of blue spruce, damp earth, and crushed needles. Cora shivered, the sweat on her back turning cold. She crossed her thick arms, trying to trap whatever warmth she possessed. Caleb noticed the movement from the corner of his eye. He didn't speak. He simply reached behind him into the wagon bed, pulled up a heavy, greasy-feeling wool blanket, and dropped it onto her lap. It smelled strongly of wet dog and old blood, but it was thick. "Thank you," she muttered, pulling it tight around her broad shoulders. "Mountain gets cold fast," he said, his eyes fixed on the steep trail ahead. They rode in silence for another 3 hours. Cora's mind churned, a dark, cynical whirlpool. "Why did he buy me?" she thought, staring at the scarred profile of his jaw. "Men like this don't need wives. They need survival gear." Maybe he was a trapper who needed someone to skin the hides and boil the fat. She looked at her own hands plump, the knuckles dimpled, but calloused from years of hauling Jeb's water and scrubbing his floors. She could work. She would prove she wasn't useless, even if she was slow. It was near dusk when they broke through a dense stand of pines into a small, rocky clearing. A cabin sat huddled against the base of a sheer granite cliff. It wasn't a pretty thing. It was built of thick, unpeeled logs, chinked with gray mud and river grass. A stone chimney leaned slightly against the western wall, puffing a thin, lazy trail of white smoke into the darkening sky. "Whoa!" Caleb commanded. The mules stopped, their sides heaving, blowing hot breath into the crisp air. He climbed down with a heavy thud, his knees popping audibly. He didn't offer a hand to help her down. Cora was grateful for that. She hated the look men got when they tried to support her weight and realized how heavy she truly was. She clambered down clumsily on her own, her boots hitting the frozen mud of the yard. Her legs were numb, vibrating from the rough ride, and she stumbled. She braced for a sarcastic comment. Instead, Caleb unhitched the mules in silence. "Go inside," he said, without looking at her. "Door ain't locked. Put some wood on the coals." Cora approached the heavy slab door. She pushed it open, the leather hinges groaning. Inside, it was dark, smelling intensely of cured meat, wood ash, and old leather. There was a single room. A heavy oak table, 2 sturdy chairs, a cast iron stove, and a bed in the corner built directly into the logs. She moved to the stove, her heavy boots loud on the packed dirt floor. She found the wood box, lifted a split log, and fed it into the glowing red embers. The fire caught quickly, casting dancing, orange light across the rough-hewn walls. When Caleb finally entered, carrying 2 sacks of flour and a canvas bag of coffee, the cabin suddenly felt incredibly small. He was huge, but she was large too. She felt like a boulder, taking up the center of the room. She immediately backed away toward the far wall, bumping her hip hard against the edge of the table. A tin cup rattled and fell to the floor with a loud clatter. Cora froze, her breath catching in her throat. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I'm sorry. I'm clumsy." Caleb set the sacks down on the table. He bent, picked up the tin cup, and set it upright. He turned to look at her. She was pressed flat against the logs, her arms wrapped around herself, trying desperately to pull her stomach in, to compress her broad shoulders, to take up less of the air he breathed. "You don't need to do that," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Do what?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her vow to be strong. "Shrink down," Caleb said. He pulled off his heavy coat, hanging it on a peg by the door. Underneath, his flannel shirt was stretched tight across a barrel chest. "You're trying to make yourself into a ghost. Ain't gonna work. You're a solid woman." Cora's cheeks burned hot. The shame was a physical ache behind her ribs. "I know I'm too big," she said bitterly, the cynicism finally breaking through her fear. "You don't need to remind me. I know what I am. I'm too big for this cabin. I'm too big for that wagon. I know." Caleb walked over to her. He moved quietly for a man of his size. He stopped just 2 feet away, smelling of frost and horse sweat. He didn't reach out to touch her. He just looked at her, his pale amber eyes studying the defensive, angry jut of her chin, the way her heavy breasts rose and fell with her panicked breathing. "Them fools down in Oakhaven want a woman who snaps in a stiff breeze," Caleb said slowly, thoughtfully. "They want something they can tuck in a pocket. I don't." He raised one large, scarred hand, calluses thick and yellowed, and let his knuckles briefly, lightly graze the side of her thick, rounded shoulder. "I bought you because I saw you hauling 2 buckets of water uphill while your brother stood in the shade," Caleb stated, grounding the moment in blunt reality. He paused, his gaze dropping to her waist, then back to her eyes. "And you ain't too big, Cora. You're just right for my arms." Morning arrived not with a gentle dawn, but with a brutal, biting cold that seeped through the mud chinking of the log walls. Cora woke with a sharp gasp, her breath pluming in a white cloud above her face. She was in the bed. She remembered Caleb pointing to it last night, dropping a heavy bearskin over the mattress of dried pine boughs and telling her to lie down. He had taken the floor, rolling himself into his greasy elk-hide coat next to the dying stove. She sat up, the joints in her knees and lower back throbbing with a dull, familiar ache. The cabin was silent, save for the rhythmic whistling snore coming from the massive shape by the hearth. Cora pulled her worn gray dress tightly over her broad shoulders. She didn't wait for him to wake. If she was property, she needed to prove she wasn't a bad investment. The cynical voice in her head, honed by years of her brother's sneers, whispered that the moment Caleb realized how much she ate, he would haul her right back down the mountain. She moved to the stove, stepping carefully over his sprawled boots. The iron was freezing to the touch. She found a tin container of matches, struck one against the rough stone of the chimney, and fed kindling into the grate. The sulfur smell burned her nose, followed by the comforting, sharp scent of burning spruce. From the canvas sacks he had brought in, she found salt pork, coarse cornmeal, and coffee beans that looked more like scorched pebbles. She didn't ask permission. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet, feeling the satisfying, solid weight of it in her thick hand, and sliced the pork with a hunting knife she found on the table. The fat sizzled loudly as it hit the hot iron, spitting grease onto her knuckles. She barely felt the sting. Behind her, the floorboards groaned. Caleb stood up. He didn't stretch or yawn. He simply rose from the floor, like a hibernating animal, disturbed from its rest. He ran a scarred hand through his tangled, iron-gray beard and watched her. Cora tensed, her broad back stiffening. She waited for the reprimand. She waited for him to tell her she was wasting his rations. "Smells good," he rasped, his voice thick with sleep. He walked past her, opening the heavy slab door to let the bitter morning air sweep through the room. He stepped out to relieve himself and check the mules. Cora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She poured a generous amount of bacon grease into the cornmeal, mixing it with water from a bucket, and formed thick, heavy cakes. She patted them flat, her large, dimpled hands moving with practiced efficiency. When Caleb returned, carrying an armful of split logs, breakfast was on the table. 2 tin plates. She had given him 3 massive slices of pork and taken only 1 small burnt end for herself, along with a single corn cake. He dropped the wood into the bin with a loud clatter. He sat at the table, the oak chair protesting under his immense weight. He looked at his plate, then looked at hers. A heavy frown pulled at his chapped lips. Without a word, Caleb reached over with his fork, speared 2 thick slices of greasy pork from his pile, and dropped them onto her plate. He followed it with another corn cake. Cora stared at the food. Panic flared hot in her chest. "I don't need that much," she lied quickly, her voice tight. "I'm not hungry. I don't want to eat into your winter stores." Caleb took a long sip of the bitter, black coffee. He didn't look angry, just terribly weary of the lie. "You're a large woman, Cora. Large women need food. A plow horse don't work on a pony's feed." It was a blunt, utilitarian statement. A town woman would have slapped him for the comparison. Cora just blinked, the bluntness of it disarming her defense. He wasn't shaming her. He was stating a fact of survival. "Eat," he commanded quietly. "Got to process a buck I shot 2 days ago. Need your help, hauling it up to the beam." They spent the afternoon behind the cabin. The cold was a physical weight, numbing her cheeks and turning her nose raw. The deer was half frozen, its stiff legs jutting awkwardly. Caleb threw a rope over a thick pine branch. He grabbed one end, tying the other to the buck's hind legs. "Pull when I say," he grunted, his boots slipping in the frosted mud. Cora wrapped the rough hemp rope around her thick forearms. The coarse fibers bit into her skin. "Pull," he grunted. She leaned back. She didn't use just her arms. She used her broad back, her heavy hips, the sheer, undeniable mass of her body. She threw her weight backward, her heavy boots digging deep trenches into the soil. The rope went taut, humming with tension. Caleb hauled beside her, and together, the heavy carcass lifted off the ground, clearing the dirt smoothly. Caleb tied off the rope. He turned to her, his chest heaving slightly. His pale amber eyes scanned her flushed face, her thick arms still holding the tension of the pull. He didn't offer a flowery compliment. He didn't call her strong. "Good," he said, wiping a streak of blood from his coat. "Took me an hour to do that alone last time. You hold your ground." Cora looked down at her muddy boots. A strange, unfamiliar heat blossomed under her ribs, entirely separate from the exertion. For the first time in her life, the space she took up didn't feel like a sin. It felt like an anchor. Winter slammed into the mountain a week later. It didn't arrive gradually. It fell from the sky in thick, blinding sheets of white that buried the yard and trapped them inside the small cabin. For 3 days, the wind howled like a wounded dog against the log walls, forcing snow through the tiny cracks in the mud, chinking. The isolation was absolute. Inside, the air was dense with the smell of wood smoke, boiling beans, and wet wool. The small space forced them into a tight orbit. Cora couldn't move without brushing against his coat, and he couldn't turn without his elbow grazing her heavy hip. On the 4th night, the temperature dropped drastically. The fire in the iron stove roared, eating through the wood at an alarming rate, but the cold still radiated from the floorboards, biting at their ankles. Cora sat at the table, a torn woolen sock stretched over her fist, clumsily attempting to darn the heel by the dim, flickering light of a tallow candle. Her fingers were stiff and aching. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, greasing his heavy boots with bear fat. The silence between them had grown comfortable over the past weeks, but tonight, the crushing weight of the storm outside made the air inside feel brittle. Cora's needle slipped. The sharp metal drove deep into the fleshy pad of her thumb. She hissed, dropping the sock. A bright bead of blood welled up instantly, stark red against her pale, calloused skin. Caleb looked up. He set the boot down, wiped his greasy hands on a rag, and walked over to the table. "Let me see." "It's nothing," she snapped, her defensive instinct flaring instantly. She tried to pull her hand away, ashamed of her clumsiness, ashamed of her thick, ungraceful fingers. Just a prick. "I'm clumsy." Caleb didn't listen. His large hand, rough as sandpaper, wrapped gently around her thick wrist. He didn't squeeze, he just held her steady. He brought her hand closer to the candle flame, examining the small puncture. "Ain't deep," he murmured. He reached to the shelf, poured a splash of harsh whiskey over a clean rag, and pressed it to her thumb. It stung fiercely. Cora flinched, pulling back again. This time, he let her go. But he didn't step back. He stood close, towering over her, smelling of leather, grease, and sweat. The proximity made her chest tight. The cynicism that had protected her for 30 years suddenly felt like a cage. She looked up at his face, at the weathered lines around his pale eyes, the iron gray in his beard. "Why did you keep me?" The words tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop them, harsh and jagged. "The snow is down. You can't take me back now. But when the thaw comes, when the food gets low, what then? Are you going to sell me back to the saloon? I know I eat too much. I know I take up too much room." Caleb's expression darkened, not with anger, but with a deep, heavy frustration. He looked down at her, his jaw setting into a hard line. "You think I threw $10 away on a woman just to haul her back down the mountain?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the sound of the howling wind. "I think men like you don't keep women like me," she shot back, her voice shaking, her broad shoulders trembling. "I'm a heavy, ugly thing, Caleb. I know it. Jeb told me every day. The town told me. I'm waiting for the joke to end." Caleb stepped closer. He didn't reach for her hands. He reached for her waist. His massive hands, thick and unyielding, gripped her broad, fleshy hips. He pulled her flush against him. Cora gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to push against his barrel chest, but he didn't budge. The heat radiating off his body was immense. For the first time, she felt entirely engulfed. She didn't feel monstrous. She felt matched. "I didn't buy a servant," Caleb said fiercely, looking down into her wide, panicked eyes. "I don't give a damn what that rat of a brother told you. I spent 10 winters up here alone. The wind gets so loud it makes a man want to tear his own ears off. I wanted a woman who could stand the cold. A woman who wouldn't blow away when the mountain got rough." He slid one hand up her back, feeling the heavy, solid flesh beneath the worn cotton dress. His fingers tangled in the thick, unpinned hair at the nape of her neck. "You ain't a heavy, ugly thing," he muttered, his voice losing its rough edge, becoming something grounded and deeply sincere. "You're solid. You hold the heat. You don't flinch when the blood spills. And you pull your own weight." Cora stared at him, the cynical armor cracking, splintering, and finally falling away in the quiet, suffocating warmth of the cabin. A single tear, hot and unbidden, slipped down her flushed cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Caleb lowered his head. He didn't kiss her gently. He kissed her with the same desperate, practical hunger a starving man takes to bread. It was rough, tasting of whiskey and salt, but it was incredibly grounding. Cora's thick arms, the arms she had always hated, reached up and wrapped around his thick neck, pulling him closer. They fit. The jagged edges of his solitary life slotted perfectly into the heavy, expansive reality of hers. "Bed's cold," Caleb muttered against her temple, his breath hot against her skin. "Fire's dying." "Then let's go to sleep," Cora whispered back, her voice thick, but steady. He didn't carry her. She wouldn't have let him try. They walked to the bed together. When they lay down under the heavy bearskin, the cold didn't matter anymore. Cora pressed her broad back against his chest, feeling his thick arm wrap heavily around her waist, pulling her flush against him. She took up half the bed, and for the first time in her life, the man beside her didn't complain about the space she occupied. He just held tighter, anchoring himself to her warmth, while the winter raged uselessly outside. If you found yourself captivated by Cora and Caleb's raw, unflinching journey of survival and acceptance, you won't want to miss our next story. We bring you grounded, deeply human audio dramas that strip away the cliches and deliver real emotional impact. Help us keep these frontier tales alive by hitting that like button, sharing this video with a friend who loves authentic storytelling, and subscribing to the channel for more unforgettable Western romances. See you on the trail.